George Harrison's presence in the Beatles was often quiet, even understated. He rarely raised his voice, avoided confrontations, and maintained a meditative calm. Yet, beneath that serenity lay a simmering frustration, a quiet bitterness that deepened over time. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney dominated the band's creative identity, George felt overlooked, suffocated, and underappreciated. This wasn't a public struggle, it was deeply personal. The tension grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, shaped by years of being the third voice in a trio. George's silence was both his shield and his statement, a subtle rebellion against being constantly marginalized. Early beginnings. George Harrison's musical journey began on the streets of Liverpool. As a teenager riding the school bus, he met Paul McCartney, whose confidence and talent immediately impressed him. They shared chords, swapped records, and bonded over skiffle and rock and roll. McCartney, older and more assertive, became both a mentor and a magnet for George's admiration. By 1958, George joined Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, at just 15, after a second audition arranged by McCartney. Impressing Lennon with his guitar skills, George earned a place in the band. From the very start, he was stepping into someone else's story, setting the stage for both brilliance and long-term frustration. Walking into someone else's story. In the early Beatles years, Harrison was learning, absorbing, and following Lennon and McCartney's lead. Lennon and McCartney crafted the band's sound, their songwriting dominating every album. George, quieter and more introspective, often deferred to their vision. Initially, this was enough. He admired their brilliance and learned from it. But as the band's fame skyrocketed, the gap between him and his bandmates widened. Nicknamed the Quiet Beatle by the press, George's introversion masked something heavier, a growing sense of exclusion. The more he tried to contribute, the more his voice was lost in the whirlwind of McCartney's perfectionism and Lennon's dominant personality. Creative suffocation. By the mid-1960s, Harrison's musical ideas and spiritual insights began to clash with the band's dynamic. He experimented with Indian music, guitar innovations, and songwriting, but his contributions were often sidelined. McCartney, meticulous and controlling in the studio, frequently overrode his ideas. "He ruined me as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from years of being subtly undermined," Harrison would later admit. The Lennon-McCartney partnership acted as an empire within the band, leaving George marginalized. Frustration, once mild, hardened into resentment. What began as admiration and loyalty slowly morphed into a quiet bitterness, a private struggle that contrasted sharply with the band's public image of camaraderie and harmony. Breaking point in the studio. The tensions became most apparent during the White Album sessions in 1968. Harrison had grown into a confident songwriter, ready to assert himself creatively. In the studio, however, old patterns persisted. McCartney, driven by control, dominated sessions, while Lennon's focus wavered amid his personal life. Harrison, no longer willing to be overlooked, pushed back. During the recording of Two of Us, a subtle but cutting exchange occurred. Harrison said, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." Calm, quiet, but resolute. The line reflected years of restraint finally reaching a breaking point. Harrison's solo rebellion. George continued to channel frustration into music with albums like 1973's Living in the Material World and songs such as Sue Me, Sue You Blues, reflecting tensions over the Beatles' legal battles. McCartney's lawsuit to dissolve their partnership felt like betrayal, deepening Harrison's distrust. He acknowledged Paul's talent but recognized the overpowering nature of his personality. The problem was never about skill, it was about space and respect. Harrison needed room to grow, yet the Beatles' internal hierarchy had consistently denied it. These experiences shaped him as an artist who valued autonomy and spiritual exploration over public recognition or compromise with others' egos. Lennon's complex influence. Harrison's relationship with John Lennon, though less openly tense, was equally complicated. In the early years, Lennon served as both mentor and inspiration. But as Lennon became absorbed in his relationship with Yoko Ono and personal pursuits, he grew emotionally distant. Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality was met with sarcasm, not curiosity. What had once been camaraderie turned into indifference. The emotional sting of being ignored by someone he idolized cut differently than McCartney's dominance. Harrison's bond with Lennon, rich in early mentorship, eventually faded into quiet estrangement, leaving scars that would linger even as the world celebrated the Beatles' legacy. The wounds that lingered. George's reflections in his 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine, reveal the depth of these wounds. Mentions of Lennon were sparse, a deliberate silence that spoke volumes. Though he had once followed Lennon's lead, Harrison's respect coexisted with pain. The emotional imbalance with both McCartney and Lennon left him navigating complicated terrain. Admiration intertwined with hurt, loyalty mixed with resentment. Even Lennon's tragic death in 1980 elicited grief expressed through music rather than overt sentiment. Harrison's silence was intentional, a philosophical choice reflecting unresolved emotions rather than indifference. Later years and reflection. By the 1990s, George Harrison had stepped largely out of the Beatles' shadow. His career as a solo artist, philanthropist, and spiritual thinker was well established. Yet, the echoes of past tensions remained. Interviews were reflective, dry, and often tinged with irony. Harrison no longer romanticized the Beatles' early years, but recounted them with honesty and subtle critique. His remarks about missing the band were pointed. Not with the others, no. Even decades later, old wounds shaped his perspective, showing that time and distance could not entirely erase the emotional weight of his formative years in one of history's most famous bands. Reunion and lingering tensions. The 1994 Beatles anthology project brought George back to the studio with McCartney, Ringo Starr, and unfinished Lennon demos. While the reunion was celebrated publicly, private dynamics revealed unresolved tensions. George bristled under Paul's direction, joking that it felt like going back to school. Jeff Lynne, who produced with Harrison in the Traveling Wilburys, recalled George rolling his eyes whenever McCartney became overbearing. McCartney acknowledged that old patterns persisted, describing their interactions as occasionally tense but manageable. Even in moments of collaboration, the legacy of control and resentment influenced Harrison's behavior, demonstrating how past wounds can endure despite outward reconciliation. Final years and illness. By the late 1990s, Harrison faced a private battle with cancer, first in the throat and later spreading to the lungs and brain. During these years, he lived mostly in seclusion with his wife Olivia and son Darnie at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames. Despite illness, his wit and philosophical perspective remained intact. In a 2001 online chat, when asked if McCartney still annoyed him, Harrison responded indirectly with a Victorian proverb, blending elegance with subtle pointedness. Even facing death, his reflections on friendship, fault, and forgiveness were measured, revealing the continued complexity of his relationships with former bandmates. A quiet farewell. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at a friend's home in Los Angeles. He was surrounded by loved ones, leaving a legacy of music, spirituality, and thoughtful reflection. Though McCartney and Ringo publicly mourned, the deep, private tensions between George and Paul never fully dissolved. Their final moments together were quiet, personal, and intimate, a far cry from the conflicts of their youth. Harrison's life reflected a delicate balance of admiration, love, and lingering bitterness. His silence often spoke louder than words, embodying a lifelong struggle for recognition, respect, and peace within the very band that defined him. Legacy of the Quiet Beatle, George Harrison's story is one of subtle rebellion and quiet resilience. He was never the loudest Beatle, but his contributions reshaped music and culture. Beneath his calm exterior lay emotional depth shaped by complex relationships, suppressed creativity, and personal loss. Through his solo work, philanthropy, and spiritual pursuits, Harrison carved an identity independent of the Beatles' shadow. He demonstrated that quiet strength could coexist with unspoken frustration, and that creativity often emerges most powerfully when one claims space for oneself. Harrison's life remains a testament to the power of persistence, reflection, and the understated intensity of the human spirit.